I want to take some time to talk to you about the nature of prayer over the next few weeks. Today, as we talk about prayer, I want us to look at one of the aspects of prayer that's honestly pretty difficult for all of us at various times. No matter how long you've been praying, I think this can be a challenge for anybody. But let me just say this. As we begin to talk about prayer, I want to help frame why prayer is important and why it matters in the life of a Christian. So let's start with this. Let's say that prayer is a key spiritual discipline or a key spiritual practice, meaning that it precedes numerous other practices. In other words, prayer is one of these practices that we do as Christians that kind of helps to unlock various other aspects of the Christian life. It's the thing that we do when we want to learn how to approach God on his terms. We learn to pray so that we can learn to approach God on his terms, to come to him the way that he wants us to come to him, not the way that we think we should just be able to come to him. Secondly, prayer is where we learn to practice what we like to call withness, where we learn what it is to live with God in relationship with him and to really experience the fullness of his presence, to have this awareness that in everything that I say and everything that I do, everywhere that I go, Jesus is present. We begin to learn that as we learn to pray. And thirdly, as a key practice that helps to unlock these other aspects of the Christian life, prayer is where we learn what it is to surrender to God. A great deal of what it is to be a Christian is to actually learn what it is to stop doing things my way and instead to start to do them God's way, to start to trust that God's wisdom and God's way is better than my wisdom and my way. And prayer is one of the key places that we learn what it is to actually surrender to God. The thing about prayer is that you will go through seasons in your life where you feel really good about praying. And then there will be other seasons where you just feel like maybe prayer has gone stale for you. Prayer has never been about how you or I feel, but it's always been about having this open dialogue, this open communication with God. There's a wonderful old saint named Teresa of Avila who was kind of a mentor and a spiritual director to various others. And Teresa of Avila had this great statement. To paraphrase it, when it comes to prayer, we are all beginners, or we are all novices when it comes to prayer. In other words, you're never going to master it, even though there may be times in your life where you feel like you get better at it. Prayer is always something that you're going to be developing and learning because you are always going to be changing and transforming. And the circumstances of your life and the circumstances of your prayers are going to be changing and transforming. So because of that, you're always going to be a beginner when it comes to prayer. As Christians, though, we have to ask ourselves a question. Is there a model for us when it comes to prayer? How do we begin to learn what it really is to pray? And of course, we have the Lord's Prayer, which is given to us in various places in the Gospels and the New Testament. But even before Jesus gives us his model prayer, there is a book in the Bible that is completely dedicated to showing us what prayer can look like. And it's the book of Psalms. The Psalms is really our prayer book in the Scriptures. I believe the Psalms is a great place to go when you want to build an understanding or vocabulary for prayer and worship and praise and adoration. When you want to get to understand what it is to be a human here in all the muck of life, trying to connect with God who is holy, the Psalms is a great place to go. In fact, 2/3 of the Psalms are prayers of what we would call lament, where they are dealing with suffering and doubt. Isn't it fascinating that the book in the Bible that most models prayer for us, 2/3 of it is all about dealing with suffering and doubt. It's almost as if God knew that most of us were going to need to turn to him in prayer when we were in doubt and when we were suffering. In fact, I would say this, the chief lesson of the Psalms is that God, as a loving father, embraces us even when we beat against his chest. I mean, imagine. You read some of the psalmists, and they're saying things like, God, would you just kill all my enemies? Would you just eliminate these people? And God is hearing these honest prayers from people that we would regard as heroes of the faith. But those prayers don't typically end there. They usually have a point in which they turn. See, it's what we would call a lament. And I like to say that a lament has two parts to it. One, it's honest, and two, it's honoring, right? A lament is honest about what you're going through. It's all the stuff that I'm going through. And then two, it's honoring or hopeful, where we honor God and we remember that he's our hope. So God, everything right now really stinks, but you are still the hope of my life. the treasure that I found. That's what the Psalms teaches us to do. It teaches us to be able to come to God as a loving father, even when we are children that are just beating against his chest. That's to say that God welcomes our honesty, he welcomes our struggles, and recognizing that we are children unable to understand everything. That's what prayer is about. It's about coming to God with honesty. It's about coming to God with our struggles. It's about coming to God with the good things. But it's also about coming to God from the perspective, not of being able to look at God and make demands of him, but from the perspective of, I'm a child and I don't understand everything that's happening, so I'm coming to my Father who can help me through this. That's what it's about. So the question, though, for us is this. If God already knows everything, then why do I need to pray? Right? Like, if God is all-knowing and God has this perspective over all of human history where he is understanding and ultimately wise, just like we're saying, prayer anchors us to the truth of God's wisdom. If we know that, then why do I need to pray in the first place? And doesn't it just sometimes feel like as I pray, my words are just bouncing off the ceiling? Why do I need to pray in the first place if God knows everything? Well, I would say it's because perhaps prayer is about more than just asking. Perhaps prayer is about more than just asking God for stuff. Perhaps prayer is about more than just coming to God with our needs. Perhaps prayer is supposed to be something deeper, something more meaningful, something more significant. So if there's one thought that I want to help frame the rest of this time that we have today, it's simply this. It's that following Jesus means staying close to him, even when we don't understand. If you're going to follow Jesus, you're going to be a Christian, then it means you need to learn what it is to stay close to him, even when you don't understand where he's leading you, even when you don't understand what he's doing, even when you don't understand what's happening. You need to stay close to Jesus. In order to make this make sense, we're going to do kind of a case study from a story in the Gospel of Mark today. This story is going to come to us from Mark chapter 9, verses 14 through 27. Now, before we dive into the text, I want to give you a little bit of background. So Mark's gospel is probably the oldest of the four gospels. And in his gospel, Mark demonstrates for us Jesus who's always at work. He's always going to this and going to that and going to this. And suddenly he was here. And then he was there. There's no like breathing room in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is just active and moving and constantly going. And that's what we see here. There's a story that precedes this one where Jesus takes three of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, up onto what we call the Mount of Transfiguration. He takes these three disciples up the mountain with him. He leaves the other 9 disciples at the bottom of the mountain. And when he does, he's up there on the mountain and they begin to witness a miracle. All of a sudden, Jesus' appearance begins to change. He basically like begins to glow. Light is emanating from Jesus. And then a cloud consumes the mountain. And as the cloud is consuming the mountain, they recognize that this is the presence of God. This is like Moses on Sinai kind of stuff. And then, if it weren't enough, Moses and Elijah themselves show up and begin having a conversation with Jesus. Have you ever been invited to a party by somebody, and then all of a sudden they started having a conversation with a couple of other people that were already at the party, and you realized how you were not a part of that circle? Like you thought you were close to this individual, but you recognize all of a sudden you're not a part of that circle. That's how I imagine Peter, James, and John are feeling in this moment. They look up and they see Jesus conversing with the 2 great prophets of the Old Testament. And as Jesus is conversing with them, Peter has what he thinks is a brilliant idea. He's like, Jesus, it's really good for us to be here. Look at this. We're experiencing the presence of God. We've got, Moses and Elijah and you all together. Why don't we build 3 tabernacles or 3 temples here? One for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. 3 dwelling places for you. And then God the Father speaks from the cloud and reiterates that Jesus is his son. And all of a sudden, Moses and Elijah are gone and the cloud is gone. And there's Jesus, still glowing, still radiant from the experience. And Peter, James, and John are beginning to realize for the first time in a very real way, Jesus is not just a miracle worker. He's not just a teacher. He's not just a prophet. Jesus is God. And then they come down the mountain. So imagine with me for a moment. Peter, James, and John have just had the highest of spiritual highs up on the mountain with Jesus. And now they are coming down to the bottom of the mountain. They're going to find the other 9 disciples. and a whole lot of other stuff going on. Just quick note, this is often how it goes in your life in spirituality. You'll have these really big high moments with God, and then you'll come back down into the rest of life. And you have to determine if what happened on the mountain can sustain you in the valley. The answer is yes. The question is whether or not you can anchor yourself to it. So here we go. Mark chapter 9, verses 14 through 27. When they returned to the other disciples, so Jesus, Peter, James, and John, when they returned to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd surrounding them, and some teachers of religious law were arguing with them. When the crowd saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with awe, and they ran to greet him, right? They see Jesus coming down the mountain, and he is glowing from this experience. And they run to greet him, and as they're coming to him, Jesus looks at them, and he's like, what is all of this arguing about? What is going on? I go up on the mountain for a few hours. I come back down, and here you all are, bickering and fighting. See, when we're confronted by something that we don't understand, we tend to argue about it instead of waiting for Jesus. A key issue in prayer is having a willingness to wait. As we look at this story as a case study in prayer, let's recognize what's going on here. Jesus has had this amazing encounter up on the mountain. Peter and James and John got to be there for it. They come back down the mountain. 9 of the disciples are there. There's a crowd arguing with them. Jesus wades into the melee of the crowd and he says, what is going on? What are you arguing about? And here's the problem. For so many of us, we would rather bicker and fight and argue about the stuff going on around us instead of just waiting on God. Instead of just pausing and waiting to see what God would say, to see what God would do, or really even taking the time to consult him. When it comes to prayer, we need to learn to stop arguing and stop coming up with our opinions, stop coming up with our solutions, and instead wait on Jesus. Learn what it is to be patient and allow him to do in his time what only he can do. So one of the men in the crowd spoke up to Jesus and he said, "Teacher, I brought my son so that you could heal him. He is possessed by an evil spirit that won't let him talk. And whenever this spirit seizes him, it throws him violently to the ground. Then he foams at the mouth, and he grinds his teeth, and he becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast out the evil spirit, but they couldn't do it." Now, just remember, the disciples of Jesus at this point, they have cast out demons before. So this man who has this son, who we will learn for years and years has been dealing with demonic possession, brings his son to these demon exorcists, these guys that have been following Jesus that have experience with this, thinking this is the opportunity. These are the ones that can help to set my son free. He brings his son to those 9 disciples, and he wants to see his son set free from the demon. So Jesus, he says he brings them to them, and none of them can help him. Imagine this father's state of mind right now. He has gone years and years where he has probably taken his son to these various Jewish exorcists, and they haven't been able to help him. People have probably told him old family remedies, then that hasn't helped him. And now here he is. He comes to the 9 disciples. And could you imagine these 9 knuckleheads at the bottom of the mountain arguing about how to cast a demon out of this kid, and then none of them could do it. None of them could do it. And then here comes Jesus, glowing from the mountain, and he comes into the tension of that moment. And Jesus looks at them and he says, "You faithless people, how long must I be with you? How long must I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." Immediately, Jesus takes control of the situation. So they brought the boy. But when the evil spirit saw Jesus, it threw the child into a violent convulsion. He fell to the ground, writhing and foaming at the mouth. So this demon recognizes Jesus and recognizes who Jesus is. And the demon panics and he starts to torment the child. And Jesus, in the middle of that tormenting, foaming at the mouth, writhing on the ground moment, calmly looks at the father of this child and he says, "How long has this been happening? How long has this been happening?" A quick little note here. Jesus cared for this father as much as he cared for the boy that was demon-possessed. I mean, imagine the frustrations that this guy has dealt with all these years. People have tried to convince him that they could do something. No one could do anything. And then finally, he gets the boy to Jesus, the one guy that he has heard has always been successful in exorcisms. And Jesus pauses long enough in the middle of this violence and confusion to deal with the father's hurt. How long has your son been going through this? He took time to ask questions and to address the issue. So the father replies to Jesus, since he was a little boy, the Spirit often throws him into the fire or into the water trying to kill him. Have mercy on us and help us if you can. This demon in this child not only is causing him to writhe on the ground and foam at the mouth, but he is trying to burn the child to death, and he is trying to drown the child. And so this father has been dealing with this for years. For years, he's had to make sure that his son is alive. For years, he's had to try to take care of this thing that's so beyond his power. It's so beyond his control. And he loves his son. He didn't turn his son out. He keeps his son with him. He's trying everything he can. He comes to Jesus and he says, Jesus, just if you can, have mercy on us and help us. Listen, something that would be really easy to overlook when we look at this story that I think is an important thing to note. There are demons. Demons are real. This doesn't happen, and it doesn't say that Jesus is healing this boy of some sort of illness. No, Jesus is about to cast a demon out of this child. And to pretend that the darkness or the demonic does not exist today would just be silly. To pretend that we don't deal with those things in our world today would just be silly. Or to just pretend that those things only happen in faraway places where they, openly practice witchcraft. That would be silly. The demonic and the oppressive and the dark happens every single day in our world. There's so much darkness in our postmodern Western American world that we can recognize it. It's palpable. You can feel the tension in our culture. There are demons. And Jesus could have looked at the issue with this boy and dismissed it as an issue of illness, but he doesn't. And when the demon realizes that it's being brought to Jesus, it panics. You see, when we pray, we need to recognize something. Whether or not we experience something tangible when we pray, or whether or not we see something observable, is completely irrelevant. Because prayer is the place where we bring our tangible human issues to the invisible God, trusting that he could do more than we could ever imagine. Think of it this way. The father of this child can see the tangible manifestations of what this tormenting demon is doing to his child. It's trying to kill him. It's trying to burn him. But what is it doing interior? What is happening in the interior life of this child because of this demon, because of this possession? Is there something raging within the child? I would say yes. And what's amazing about prayer is this recognition that while we believe that our invisible God can move in very tangible ways in our tangible world, that part of what we experience in prayer is not simply the release of the things that we can observe, but also that God is at work like behind the scenes in the invisible, that things are happening that we cannot observe, that miracles sometimes happen in very supernatural ways that we cannot quantify. And it's okay to think that way. Sometimes we think that everything has to be explainable and everything has to be completely rational. No, there's a very spiritual world at work overlapping our world. And Jesus, when he confronts it, has all authority and all power, and he deals with it. And when we pray, we are invited into that same power and authority. Let's continue in the text. Jesus looks at the father and he says, what do you mean if I can? Remember, the father has just said, help us if you can. And Jesus says, what do you mean if I can? Anything is possible if a person believes. And then this is the line of lines. I love this statement. The father instantly cried out, I do believe, but help me overcome my unbelief. Jesus, I do believe that you could do it, but I have so many reasons to doubt. Your 9 guys that were here, they couldn't do it. The professional exorcists employed by the Jews, they couldn't do it. No one has been able to help my son. And I believe that you can, but Jesus, there's overwhelming evidence that no one's been able to help him yet. So help me to overcome my unbelief. I really believe with all my heart that prayer is not the place that we come when we are full of faith. I believe prayer is the place that we need to go when we are full of doubt. Like we tend to think of prayer as like, I can only pray about this when I really believe it could happen. Perhaps sometimes prayer is the place that we need to go when we're full of doubt. Because prayer is not just about being able to declare the truth, though it is a part of it. Prayer is also about just getting close to Jesus and allowing him to overcome our unbelief. just recognize these two things. First of all, Jesus is ready and able to do what no one else can do for this boy. And secondly, the father of the boy prays with an honest intensity. I hope that would mark the way that we pray. So, the text continues. When Jesus saw that the crowd of onlookers was growing, he rebuked the evil spirit. Listen, you spirit that makes this boy unable to hear and speak, he said. I command you, come out of the child and never enter him again. The spirit screamed and threw the boy into another violent convulsion and left him. The boy appeared to be dead. A murmur ran through the crowd as people said, he's dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and helped him to his feet, and he stood up. You see, the father of the boy may have struggled with believing in a miracle, but he stayed close to Jesus anyways. He may have struggled with believing in a miracle, but he stayed close to Jesus anyways. Prayer is about remaining close to Jesus, knowing that he can do what no one else can. The father likely had an idea of how he wanted things to go that day. He came and he figured, I'm going to take my boy to these guys. They're going to take care of it. It's not going to be a big deal. But then nothing happened for him. So often we do that with prayer, don't we? We go to God saying, you know what? It's going to happen like this. If you'll just make it go the way that I imagine it will, then everything will be great. But sometimes what we have to recognize in prayer is that God is not looking for you to invent a scenario for a miracle. Instead, he's looking for you to come to him honestly and say, I can't do anything about this. I have my doubts, but I believe that you can do it. So you do whatever you can do. You see, the father of this child knew Jesus' disciples could cast out demons, but they couldn't help his son. Your prayers may not be answered the way that you expect, but if you remain faithful to Jesus, he will answer. One of the key practices of all Christians is to learn how to pray, because prayer is about learning what it is to stay close to Jesus. Because when you're close to Jesus, that's where the miracles are. He is the God transfigured on the mountain, and he is the God in the muck casting out the demons. He's with you in your high points. He's with you in your low points. The question is, will you remain close, or will you only believe when you're on top of the mountain? Listen, Jesus invites you to believe. He invites you to pray. And I believe that's what this story is about. It's about being able to look at Jesus and say, Jesus, I trust you. So my challenge for you this week is simple. Following Jesus means staying close to him, even when you don't understand. So will you make space to remain close to Jesus this week? I believe you can. Hey, do us a favor. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe, do all this stuff. Share this content with your friends. We'll see you next time.